Have you ever wondered how quickly an ordinary person could become cruel? In the summer of 1971, a group of healthy college students volunteered for what sounded like a simple psychology experiment. They weren't criminals, they weren't soldiers, they weren't trained prison guards. They were just students looking to earn a little extra money. But within just a few days, some of them were humiliating, intimidating, and psychologically tormenting their classmates. Others were suffering emotional breakdowns, screaming uncontrollably, and begging to leave. The experiment was supposed to last 2 weeks. It was shut down after only 6 days. For decades, it became one of the most famous psychology experiments ever conducted, cited as proof that power can corrupt ordinary people. But years later, disturbing questions began to emerge. Was this really human nature on display? Or had the experiment itself quietly manipulated the outcome from the very beginning? This is the story of the Stanford Prison Experiment. It was the summer of 1971. At Stanford University in California, psychology professor Philip Zimbardo wanted to answer a question that had troubled scientists for years. How much of human behavior comes from personality, and how much comes from the situation we're placed in? Only a few years earlier, the world had watched the shocking trials of Nazi officials after World War II. Many people struggled to understand how seemingly ordinary individuals could participate in acts of cruelty. Were they simply evil, or had the circumstances transformed them? Zimbardo believed he might be able to explore that question in a controlled environment. His team placed a newspaper advertisement asking for male college students to participate in a study about prison life. The pay was $15 a day, a respectable amount for students at the time. More than 70 young men responded. Before anyone was accepted, they went through interviews, personality tests, medical examinations, and psychological evaluations. Anyone with signs of mental illness, violent behavior, criminal history, or health problems was eliminated. Eventually, 24 participants were selected. They were considered physically healthy, emotionally stable, and psychologically normal. There was nothing particularly unusual about any of them. That was exactly the point. Zimbardo didn't want extraordinary people. He wanted average people. The volunteers arrived expecting an interesting experiment and an easy paycheck. Few of them imagined that their lives would become part of psychology history. The basement of Stanford University's psychology building had been transformed into something remarkably convincing. Hallways became prison corridors, laboratory rooms became prison cells. Steel bars were installed across doorways. Each tiny cell held little more than a mattress. There was even a solitary confinement closet barely large enough for one person to stand inside. Security cameras and hidden microphones were placed throughout the building. The researchers wanted to observe everything, every conversation, every confrontation, every emotional reaction. The students were randomly divided into 2 groups. Half would become guards, the other half would become prisoners. No one chose their role. It was determined entirely by chance. The guards received khaki uniforms, mirrored sunglasses that hid their eyes, wooden batons, and whistles. The sunglasses served an important purpose. Without visible eye contact, guards appeared anonymous and emotionally distant. The prisoners received something very different. They wore loose smocks instead of normal clothes. Rubber sandals replaced their shoes. A small chain was locked around one ankle. Instead of names, each prisoner was assigned only a number. Their identities were meant to disappear. From the very beginning, individuality was being stripped away, but the experiment had not officially begun yet. The researchers wanted something much more realistic. On the morning of August 14th, the volunteers who had been assigned as prisoners were sitting at home, completely unaware of what was about to happen. Then came a knock at the door. Real police officers entered. The students were informed they were under arrest for armed robbery and burglary. Neighbors watched from their windows in confusion. Family members were stunned. The young men were handcuffed, searched, and placed into actual police cars. Most had no idea this would happen. The arrests had been carefully arranged with the Palo Alto Police Department. At the police station, The volunteers were fingerprinted, photographs were taken, personal belongings were confiscated. They were searched again. Then they were transported to Stanford's mock prison. For many participants, this was the moment the experiment stopped feeling like a game. Once inside the prison, each prisoner was ordered to remove his clothes. They were sprayed with what they were told was disinfectant. Although it was actually harmless, many believed it was real. Then they received their prison uniforms. Each prisoner was referred to only by his assigned number. No names, no individuality, no personal identity. The guards had been given only one instruction: maintain order. They had not been told exactly how to do it. Physical violence was strictly forbidden. Everything else seemed surprisingly open to interpretation. The first evening passed quietly. The guards felt awkward giving orders. Some laughed nervously. The prisoners joked with each other. Several participants smiled directly at the hidden cameras. Everyone still understood they were taking part in an experiment, or at least they thought they did. The following morning, everything changed. Several prisoners decided they would resist. They refused to obey instructions. They blocked the cell doors with their beds. They mocked the guards. Some shouted insults down the hallway. For a moment, it looked as though the prisoners had taken control. The guards were caught completely off guard. None of them had expected open rebellion on only the second day. After briefly discussing what to do, they began fighting back. Working together, they grabbed a fire extinguisher and blasted freezing carbon dioxide into the crowded cells. The prisoners stumbled backward. The barricades were removed. The guards dragged mattresses out into the hallway. The perceived leaders of the rebellion were separated from everyone else. Some prisoners were locked in solitary confinement. Others were denied blankets. The guards soon realized they didn't need physical violence to dominate the prisoners. Psychological pressure could be just as effective. Punishments became increasingly creative. Prisoners were ordered to perform endless push-ups. Sometimes another prisoner was forced to sit on the back of the person exercising, making the task even harder. They cleaned toilets with their bare hands. They stood silently against walls for long periods. They repeated their identification numbers over and over again until exhaustion. Meals became rewards rather than basic necessities. Privileges could disappear at any moment. The guards also began inventing new routines. Late at night, they blew whistles to wake everyone. They conducted surprise inspections. Beds had to be perfectly arranged. Uniforms had to remain spotless. Any mistake, no matter how small, resulted in punishment. The most striking part was how quickly these new rules appeared. No researcher had written them down. The guards were creating their own prison culture. Some remained relatively calm and professional. Others became increasingly authoritarian. A few seemed to enjoy the power. The mirrored sunglasses hid their expressions, making them appear almost emotionless. Without realizing it, many prisoners stopped referring to themselves by name. Instead, they answered only with their assigned numbers. The transformation was subtle, but it was happening. Outside the prison walls, the participants still knew this was only an experiment. Inside those walls, reality began to blur. Even the researchers noticed something unexpected. The conversations had changed. The volunteers no longer spoke like college students pretending to be prisoners. They spoke like prisoners. They worried about punishments. They negotiated for privileges. They complained about unfair treatment. Some even started turning against one another. The artificial prison was beginning to feel disturbingly real. One prisoner in particular seemed to be struggling more than the others. His identification number was 8612. At first, he had challenged the guards like everyone else. But after repeated confrontations, something changed. His breathing became rapid. He began shouting uncontrollably. He cried. He screamed that he couldn't take it anymore. He appeared to lose emotional control completely. The guards weren't sure whether he was acting. Some researchers wondered if he simply wanted to leave. But his distress looked frighteningly real. As the chaos unfolded, the experiment had been running for only about 36 hours, less than 2 days, and already, someone had completely broken. At first, the researchers believed prisoner 8612 was simply trying to escape the study. After all, every participant had signed a consent form. They had volunteered to be there. Quitting so soon seemed unlikely. But as his emotional state continued to deteriorate, it became impossible to ignore. His speech became disorganized. He shouted uncontrollably. He cried. He complained of headaches, rage, and panic. Eventually, the researchers decided they had no choice. Prisoner 8612 was released. He became the first participant to leave the experiment. Instead of calming the situation, his departure made everything worse. The remaining prisoners began wondering if they were trapped. Rumors spread that 8612 was planning to return with friends and break everyone out. The guards heard the same rumor. Instead of dismissing it, they prepared for an attack. Furniture was moved, security was tightened. Plans were made to defend the prison. The escape attempt never happened. But the fact that everyone reacted so seriously revealed something unsettling. Many participants were no longer behaving as if this were simply an experiment. They were responding as though the prison itself was real. As the days passed, the guards became increasingly inventive. Physical violence was still forbidden. Psychological control became their weapon instead. They forced prisoners to stand motionless for long periods. Some were ordered to repeat their identification numbers dozens of times. Others cleaned toilets with their bare hands. Blankets were taken away. Sleeping became a privilege instead of a right. One of the guards soon developed a reputation unlike the others. The prisoners nicknamed him John Wayne. He spoke with exaggerated authority, gave harsh commands, and constantly reminded the prisoners who was in control. Years later, he would insist that much of his behavior had been inspired by movie characters. He believed he was simply playing the role expected of him. At the time, however, the prisoners saw something very different. To them, he represented absolute power. Every morning brought new uncertainty. Would there be inspections? Would there be punishment? Would someone be singled out? The unpredictability itself became exhausting. Some prisoners stopped resisting entirely. Others became unusually obedient. Even conversations between prisoners began to change. Instead of discussing college, sports, or life outside, they talked about prison rules. Who had earned privileges? Who had caused trouble? Who might be punished next? Without anyone explicitly telling them to, they had started thinking like inmates. Then came another emotional collapse. Prisoner 819 had been removed from his cell after becoming visibly distressed. As researchers spoke with him in another room, something unexpected happened. From down the hallway came a chant. The remaining prisoners were shouting together, "Prisoner 819 is a bad prisoner." Again and again, the words echoed through the basement. 819 could hear every sentence. His face changed. He lowered his head. He appeared deeply ashamed. Although he was no longer inside the prison, psychologically, he still felt trapped by it. Zimbardo later recalled telling him something remarkable. "You are not 819. "You are," he said, using the student's real name. For a moment, the participant looked confused, almost as though he had forgotten who he was outside the experiment. Shortly afterward, prisoner 819 was also released. By now, several participants had experienced serious emotional distress. Yet the experiment continued. For Zimbardo himself, something had begun to change. He was no longer acting only as the lead researcher. He had also taken on the role of prison superintendent. Without realizing it, he found himself worrying about prison security, discipline, and maintaining order. Instead of asking whether the experiment should stop, he often focused on keeping it running. Later, he admitted this dual role had affected his judgment. Perhaps the most important person in the entire story arrived almost by accident. Her name was Christina Maslach. A young psychologist, she visited Stanford to observe the experiment after hearing colleagues talk about it. She expected to see students participating in a research project. Instead, she walked into what felt disturbingly close to a real prison. She watched prisoners being marched down the hallway with paper bags over their heads. She saw guards shouting orders. She saw exhausted young men who no longer looked like volunteers. When she left the basement, she confronted Zimbardo. "What you're doing to those boys is terrible." Her reaction surprised him. Most researchers who had visited the prison had accepted what they saw as part of the study. Maslock was different. She wasn't looking at scientific data, she was looking at human beings. That conversation forced Zimbardo to reconsider everything. The next day, only 6 days after it had begun, the Stanford Prison Experiment was officially terminated. It had been scheduled to last 2 full weeks. It never made it halfway. The story quickly spread far beyond Stanford University. Newspapers reported on the shocking events. Television programs discussed the findings. Psychology textbooks presented the experiment as powerful evidence that ordinary people could become cruel when given authority. For decades, the Stanford Prison Experiment became one of the most famous studies ever conducted. Students around the world learned the same lesson. Good people can do terrible things under the right circumstances. It seemed like a simple conclusion, perhaps too simple. Years passed, then decades. As psychology became more rigorous, researchers began looking more closely at famous experiments from the past. The Stanford Prison Experiment received renewed attention, not because people doubted it had happened, but because they began asking a different question. Did the experiment really prove what everyone believed? Archived recordings revealed conversations that many people had never heard before. In one recording, researchers appeared to encourage guards to create feelings of frustration, fear, and helplessness among the prisoners. That raised an uncomfortable possibility. If guards had been given guidance about how they should behave, were their actions truly spontaneous? Or were they responding to subtle expectations from the researchers themselves? Former participants also began sharing new perspectives. Several guards later said they believed they were expected to act tough. Some admitted they exaggerated their behavior because they thought that was the purpose of the experiment. Others insisted they had simply been improvising. The accounts often conflicted with one another. The prisoners' memories were equally complicated. Some described the emotional distress as completely genuine. Others admitted they occasionally acted dramatically because they believed it fit the situation. Reality, it seemed, was far messier than the story told in textbooks. The criticism didn't stop there. Modern psychologists pointed to several major scientific problems. The sample size was extremely small. There was no proper control group. The lead researcher became emotionally involved in the experiment. Participants may have behaved according to what they believed researchers wanted to see, a phenomenon known as demand characteristics. Taken together, these issues made it difficult to draw strong scientific conclusions. That doesn't mean the experiment was meaningless. Far from it. It changed the way psychologists think about research ethics. Today, experiments involving human participants are monitored far more closely. Independent ethics committees review studies before they begin. Participants have clearer rights to withdraw. Researchers are expected to avoid situations that could cause unnecessary psychological harm. In many ways, the Stanford Prison Experiment became a lesson not only about human behavior, but about how science itself should be conducted. More than 50 years later, the basement prison at Stanford is gone. The cells have long since disappeared, but the questions remain. How much of who we are comes from our character? How much comes from the roles society asks us to play? Would most people really become cruel if given enough authority? Or were the participants simply acting out what they believed was expected of them? There may never be a definitive answer. But perhaps the Stanford Prison Experiment revealed something even more unsettling than anyone first imagined. Not that power always corrupts, but that human beings are astonishingly good at becoming the people they believe they're supposed to be. Sometimes, the strongest prison isn't built with steel bars. It's built with expectations. And once we step inside, it can be surprisingly difficult to remember who we were before the door closed.